Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or watching movies, she could be found at the local shooting range with her grandfather. The old man had taught her everything he knew about firearms, patience, and precision. But today, as she walked into the regional shooting competition, Sarah felt more nervous than she had ever been in her life. The competition hall buzzed with activity. Dozens of experienced shooters were setting up their equipment, adjusting their expensive scopes, and talking about their latest gear upgrades. Sarah looked down at her grandfather's old rifle in her hands. The weapon was older than she was, with scratches along the barrel and a scope that had seen better days. She had saved money from her part-time job at the local diner for months to enter this competition, hoping to prove that skill mattered more than expensive equipment. As she approached the registration table, whispers followed her. The other competitors were mostly men in their 30s and 40s, with military backgrounds or years of professional shooting experience. Sarah was only 19, fresh out of high school and clearly out of place in this crowd. The registration official looked at her with surprise when she handed over her entry fee and paperwork. "Are you sure you're in the right place, miss?" the man asked, glancing at her grandfather's rifle. "This is a precision shooting competition. The entry-level competition is next month." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be, sir." The man shrugged and handed her a competitor number. As she walked away, she heard him mutter to his colleague about kids these days not knowing their limits. Sarah gripped her rifle tighter and headed to the practice range to zero her scope before the competition began. The practice session was when everything went wrong. Sarah set up at her assigned lane and took her first shot at the practice target 50 yards away. The bullet hit nowhere near the center. She adjusted her scope and tried again. Still off target. After several more attempts, she realized the horrible truth. Her scope was broken. The internal mechanisms had shifted during the drive to the competition, making it completely unreliable. Other competitors in nearby lanes began to notice her struggles. A tall man with an expensive rifle and military-style gear glanced over and chuckled. "Having some trouble there, kid?" He called out loud enough for others to hear. "Maybe you should have practiced more before entering a real competition." More shooters gathered around, drawn by the commotion. They saw Sarah's old rifle, her obvious frustration with the scope, and her young age. The comments started flying. "Look at that antique she's using," one man laughed. "My grandfather probably used something like that in Vietnam." Another added, "She's going to embarrass herself out there. Someone should tell her to go home before she wastes everyone's time." Sarah felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. These men didn't know her story. They didn't know about the countless hours she had spent with her grandfather, learning not just how to shoot, but how to read wind, how to control her breathing, and how to find her natural point of aim. They didn't know about the iron sight shooting her grandfather had made her master before he ever let her use a scope. "The scope's busted," she announced to no one in particular, removing it from her rifle with steady hands. The laughter grew louder when the competitors realized what she was doing. "She's going to try to shoot iron sights in a precision competition," someone wheezed between laughs. "This is going to be entertaining." The range officer approached Sarah with concern written on his face. "Miss, I don't think you understand what you're getting into. This competition requires shooting at targets up to 300 yards away. Without a scope, you're at a severe disadvantage. Maybe you should consider withdrawing and coming back when your equipment is working properly." Sarah looked up at the man with determination burning in her eyes. "Sir, I've paid my entry fee and I'm qualified to compete. I'd like to continue with iron sights if that's allowed under the rules." The range officer consulted his rule book and nodded reluctantly. "It's allowed, but highly unusual. I just want you to understand that you're competing against some of the best precision shooters in the state. Most of them have thousands of dollars worth of equipment and years of experience." "I understand," Sarah replied simply. Word spread quickly through the competition area about the young girl who was going to attempt precision shooting with iron sights. Competitors left their preparation to come watch what they expected to be a spectacular failure. Some placed informal bets on how badly she would perform. Others felt sorry for her and wondered if someone should intervene to save her from public humiliation. Sarah found a quiet corner of the range and sat with her rifle across her knees. She closed her eyes and remembered her grandfather's voice from years of training sessions. "Sarah, girl, fancy equipment can help a good shooter become great, but it can never make a bad shooter good." The most important parts of accurate shooting are between your ears and in your heart. Everything else is just tools. She opened her eyes and looked down at the iron sights on her rifle. They were simple, basic, and completely reliable. No batteries to die, no internal mechanisms to break, no adjustments to worry about. Just a front sight post and a rear sight notch. The same basic aiming system that shooters had used for over a century. The first stage of the competition would begin in 20 minutes. Sarah stood up and walked back to her lane, ignoring the continued whispers and pointing from other competitors. She set up her shooting mat, adjusted her rifle rest, and began the mental preparation that her grandfather had taught her. She needed to block out the noise, the pressure, and the doubt that was trying to creep into her mind. As she lay down behind her rifle and looked through the iron sights at the first target 100 yards away, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The laughter and comments faded into background noise. This was what she had trained for, what her grandfather had prepared her for. Even if neither of them had imagined it would happen like this, the broken scope had forced her back to the fundamentals, and sometimes, fundamentals were exactly what a person needed to succeed. The range officer's voice echoed across the shooting facility as he called all competitors to their assigned lanes for the first stage of the competition. Sarah picked up her rifle and gear, walking past groups of shooters who stopped their conversations to stare at her. She could feel their eyes following her every movement, waiting for her to realize her mistake and withdraw from the competition. At lane 12, Sarah set up her equipment with the methodical precision her grandfather had drilled into her over countless practice sessions. She unrolled her shooting mat, positioned her rifle rest, and checked her ammunition. Each bullet had been hand-loaded by her grandfather specifically for this rifle, crafted with the same attention to detail he had brought to everything in his life. The other competitors around her were making final adjustments to their high-tech scopes, turning tiny dials and checking digital readouts that displayed wind speed and temperature. "Competitors, you have 5 minutes for final preparation," announced the range officer. "The first stage consists of 10 shots at 100 yards. You will have 15 minutes to complete your string of fire. Scoring will be based on precision, with the highest possible score being 100 points." Sarah lay down behind her rifle and settled into her shooting position. Through the iron sights, the target looked small but manageable. She had practiced at this distance hundreds of times with her grandfather, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated wind direction and strength. The flags along the range hung limp in the still morning air, which was good news for iron sight shooting. To her left, a competitor with a rifle that probably cost more than Sarah's car was muttering about atmospheric pressure and ballistic coefficients. To her right, another shooter was using a smartphone app to calculate wind drift and bullet drop. Sarah simply closed her eyes for a moment and listened to her grandfather's voice in her memory. "Don't overthink it, girl. See the target, align the sights, control your breathing, and let the shot break naturally." "Competitors ready?" called the range officer. "Load and make ready." Sarah inserted her magazine and chambered a round. The familiar click of the bolt closing gave her confidence. This rifle had never let her down, and she wasn't going to let it down now. Around her, she could hear the electronic yow, beeping of timers and rangefinders as other competitors made their final preparations. "Commence firing." The range erupted with the sound of gunfire as dozens of competitors began their strings of fire. Sarah took her time with the first shot, settling the front sight post in the center of the rear sight notch and aligning both with the center of the target. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and gently squeezed the trigger straight back until the rifle fired. The recoil felt familiar and comfortable. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly and prepared for her second shot. She couldn't see where. Her first bullet had hit from this distance without a spotting scope, but the shot had felt good. Her natural point of aim was solid and the trigger break had been clean. Shot after shot, Sarah fell into the rhythm that years of practice had ingrained in her. Breathe, aim, squeeze, follow through, work the bolt, reload, repeat. She blocked out the sounds of other rifles firing around her, and the occasional comment from spectators who had gathered to watch the unusual sight of someone shooting iron sights in a precision competition. By her 8th shot, Sarah noticed that the competitor to her left had stopped shooting and was watching her through binoculars. His expensive rifle lay forgotten as he focused on her technique. How is she doing that? She heard him mutter to his shooting partner. She's not even using a spotting scope to check her shots. Sarah tried to ignore the attention and focus on her remaining shots. She had learned from her grandfather that the last few shots in any string were often the most important and the most difficult. Fatigue could affect her hold, and mental pressure could cause her to rush or overthink her sight alignment. Her ninth shot felt perfect from the moment she squeezed the trigger. The sight picture had been crystal clear, her breathing controlled, and the trigger press smooth and straight back. If her grandfather had been watching, he would have nodded his approval at the shot process. For her final shot, Sarah took extra time to ensure everything was perfect. She could feel the weight of expectation from the growing crowd of spectators. More competitors had finished their strings and were now watching her lane with curiosity and disbelief. She pushed all of that noise out of her mind and concentrated on the fundamentals. The last shot broke cleanly, and Sarah immediately knew it was a good one. She cleared her rifle, made it safe, and stood up from her shooting position. Her back ached slightly from the unfamiliar concrete shooting platform, but she felt good about her performance. She had no idea how well she had actually shot compared to the other competitors, but she knew she had done her best with the equipment she had. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" called the range officer. "All competitors step back from the firing line while targets are scored." The wait for scoring felt like an eternity. Sarah sat on a bench behind the firing line and drank water from her bottle while other competitors discussed their performances. Most seemed confident they had shot well, discussing which shots might have cost them points and comparing their expensive equipment. A man in his 50s approached Sarah with a respectful nod. Unlike the others who had mocked her earlier, he seemed genuinely interested in her technique. "Excuse me, miss, but I couldn't help watching your shooting process. I'm retired military and I haven't seen iron sight shooting that controlled in years. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My grandfather taught me," Sarah replied simply. "He always said that good shooting was about consistency and fundamentals, not equipment." The man smiled and extended his hand. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. I'm Robert Hayes, and I've been shooting competitively for over 20 years. What you just did takes real skill." Before Sarah could respond, the range officer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker system. "Competitors, target scoring is complete. Results for the first stage will be posted in 5 minutes. Please gather around the scoreboard for announcement of standings." The crowd of competitors and spectators moved toward the large electronic scoreboard at the front of the range. Sarah felt her stomach flutter with nervous energy. She had no idea what score she had achieved or how she compared to the field of experienced shooters. All she knew was that she had given her best effort and stayed true to the lessons her grandfather had taught her. The scoreboard flickered to life as the range officials uploaded the first stage results. Sarah stood near the back of the crowd, her heart pounding as names and scores began appearing on the screen. The competitors pushed closer to see their standings, with confident murmurs and occasional groans as people found their positions on the leaderboard. "Holy hell," someone near the front whispered, and the crowd fell silent. Sarah couldn't see the board clearly from her position, but she watched the faces of the competitors in front of her. Expressions of confidence turned to confusion, then to outright disbelief. Heads turned as people began looking around for someone, their eyes scanning the crowd until they found Sarah standing quietly in the back. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the range officer over the loudspeaker, "I need to verify these scores before making them official, but preliminary results show some remarkable shooting in today's first stage. Robert Hayes, the retired military man who had spoken with Sarah earlier, pushed through the crowd until he reached her. His face showed a mixture of amazement and respect. "Young lady, you need to see this," he said, gently guiding her toward the front of the group. As Sarah moved closer to the scoreboard, she could finally read the results clearly. Her eyes scanned down the list of names and scores, looking for her competitor number. She found it at the top of the board and her breath caught in her throat. Competitor 47, Mitchell. S 98 out of 100 points. The next closest score was 94 points, achieved by a shooter whose rifle and scope combination probably cost more than Sarah's entire year of college tuition. She had not only succeeded with iron sights, she had dominated the field. The silence stretched uncomfortably as competitors processed what they were seeing. A 19-year-old girl with a rifle older than most of them had just outshot some of the most experienced precision shooters in the region. Using iron sights. At 100 yards, her 10 shots had clustered so tightly that the scoring officials had needed to measure with calipers to determine the exact point values. "There has to be a mistake," muttered the tall shooter who had mocked Sarah during practice. "She couldn't possibly have shot better than 98 with iron sights. Someone screwed up the scoring." The range officer overheard the comment and addressed the crowd. "I understand there may be questions about these results. As a matter of protocol, we had 3 different officials score the targets independently. All 3 came up with identical results. Competitor 47 fired 2 shots in the 10 ring worth 10 points each, 7 shots in the 9 ring worth 9 points each, and 1 shot in the 8 ring worth 8 points. Total score, 98 out of 100. A woman in expensive shooting gear stepped forward. "I'd like to see the target," she said boldly. "No offense to the young lady, but this seems highly unusual." "Of course," replied the range officer. "We'll display all targets for review during the break between stages." When Sarah's target was posted on the viewing board, the crowd pressed forward to examine it. The pattern of holes told an incredible story. 9 of her 10 shots formed a tight cluster slightly larger than a quarter in the center of the target. The 10th shot, which had cost her 2 points, was still well within the scoring rings, but had drifted slightly to the right. "Wind got that last one," observed an older competitor with decades of experience. "But look at that group. That's better shooting than most people can do with a scope." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and the scrutiny. Part of her wanted to find a quiet corner and disappear until the competition was over. But another part of her, the part that had learned determination from her grandfather's patient teaching, stood a little straighter. She had earned this score honestly, and she wouldn't apologize for shooting well. A young man wearing a shooting jacket covered in patches from various competitions approached Sarah with obvious admiration. "That was incredible shooting," he said. "I've been competing for 5 years and I've never seen anything like it." "How long have you been shooting iron sights?" "Since I was 12, Sarah replied. "My grandfather insisted I master iron sights before he would let me use a scope. He said it would make me a better shooter in the long run." "Your grandfather was absolutely right," said an elderly woman who had been quietly observing from the sidelines. "I'm Betty Morrison, and I've been running shooting competitions for 30 years. What you just accomplished is remarkable, but I have to warn you, the next stages get progressively more difficult. 200 yards, then 300 yards. The targets get smaller and the wind becomes much more of a factor." Sarah nodded respectfully. "I understand, ma'am." "I'll do my best," Betty smiled warmly. "I'm sure you will, dear. Your grandfather taught you well." As the crowd began to disperse for the break between stages, Sarah found herself surrounded by competitors who wanted to examine her rifle and ask about her training. The mockery and dismissive comments from earlier had been replaced by genuine curiosity and growing respect. The tall shooter who had been so critical during practice approached with an uncomfortable expression. "Look, I owe you an apology," he said awkwardly. "I was out of line earlier. That was some damn fine shooting." Sarah accepted his handshake and apology graciously, though she couldn't forget how quickly he had been to judge her based on her age and equipment. She was learning that respect in this sport had to be earned through performance, not granted based on expensive gear or previous accomplishments. During the break, Sarah called her grandfather from the parking lot. His voice was weak but excited when she told him about her first stage performance. "I knew you could do it, girl," he said with obvious pride. "Those iron sights won't let you down as long as you trust your training. Remember what I always told you about the longer distances? Wind is the enemy and patience is the cure." Sarah recited the lesson she had heard hundreds of times. "That's right. Take your time, read the conditions, and don't let anyone pressure you into rushing your shots. You belong out there as much as anyone else." When Sarah returned to the range for the second stage, she noticed a change in the atmosphere around her. Competitors who had ignored her earlier now nodded respectfully as she passed. The range officials seemed more attentive to her needs, and even the spectators who had gathered to watch the competition were paying attention to her lane. The second stage would be shot at 200 yards, with targets that appeared significantly smaller through iron sights. Sarah set up her equipment with the same methodical care she had used in the first stage, but she could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see if her first stage performance had been a fluke or a preview of something truly special. The 200-yard line felt different from the 100-yard position. Sarah could immediately sense the increased difficulty as she looked through her iron sights at the smaller target in the distance. The black center that had seemed manageable at 100 yards now appeared as a tiny dot that seemed to dance slightly in her vision. This was where her grandfather's endless patience and methodical training would truly be tested. Around her, the other competitors were making extensive adjustments to their high-powered scopes. She could hear the clicking of elevation and windage knobs as shooters compensated for the increased distance. Some were consulting ballistic charts and smartphone apps that calculated bullet drop and wind drift with scientific precision. Sarah had only her grandfather's teachings and her own ability to read the subtle environmental conditions. The wind had picked up slightly since the first stage, and Sarah studied the range flags carefully. The movement was inconsistent, stronger on the left side of the range where it was more exposed, lighter on the right where some buildings provided partial shelter. Her grandfather had taught her to watch for these variations and to time her shots for the most favorable conditions. "Competitors, you have 10 minutes for preparation," announced the range officer. "Stage 2 consists of 10 shots at 200 yards. Time limit is 20 minutes. Sarah settled into her shooting position and immediately noticed that her natural point of aim felt different at this distance. She made small adjustments to her body position until the rifle pointed naturally at the target without muscular tension. This was another lesson from her grandfather. The body should support the rifle, not fight it. Through her iron sights, she studied the target and tried to determine the best aiming point. At this distance, the front sight post would cover a significant portion of the scoring area, requiring her to be even more precise with her sight alignment. She would need to use a consistent sight picture for every shot and trust that her grandfather's hand-loaded ammunition would perform consistently. Shooting coach standing behind the firing line was explaining the challenges to a group of spectators. At 200 yards, even a small error in sight alignment can result in a miss. The shooters with scopes can see their targets clearly and make precise adjustments. Shooting iron sights at this distance requires exceptional skill and years of practice. Sarah tried to block out the commentary and focus on her preparation routine. She dry-fired several times to confirm her trigger control, checked her ammunition arrangement, and went through the mental checklist her grandfather had drilled into her. Breathing pattern, natural point of aim, sight alignment, trigger control, follow-through. Everything had to work together perfectly. "Load and make ready," called the range officer. Sarah chambered around and settled behind her rifle. The target seemed impossibly small through the iron sights, but she reminded herself that the fundamentals didn't change with distance. Good shooting was still about consistency and patience regardless of whether the target was 50 yards away or 500. Commence firing. For her first shot, Sarah took extra time to ensure everything was perfect. She waited for a lull in the wind, aligned her sights with extreme care, and squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure her grandfather had taught her years ago. The rifle recoiled smoothly and she worked the bolt for her second shot. Without a spotting scope, Sarah had no way to see where her bullets were hitting. She had to trust her sight alignment and hope that her grandfather's ammunition was performing as expected. This was another test of the mental discipline she had developed, the ability to execute each shot independently without being influenced by the unknown results of previous shots. By her fourth shot, Sarah noticed that the wind pattern had shifted slightly. The flags were showing more consistent movement from left to right across the range. She made a minor adjustment to her point of aim, holding slightly into the wind as her grandfather had taught her. "Don't chase the wind," he had always said. "Read it, respect it, and adapt to it." The competitor to her left finished his string and immediately began studying his target through a high-powered spotting scope. "Damn," she heard him mutter. "I dropped 2 points on that 7th shot when the wind picked up." Sarah envied his ability to see his results immediately, but she also knew that sometimes ignorance could be beneficial. Knowing about a bad shot could affect confidence for the remaining shots. Sarah's 6th shot felt slightly off as she squeezed the trigger. The sight alignment had looked good, but something about the trigger break hadn't felt quite right. She took an extra moment to recenter herself mentally before continuing. Her grandfather had taught her that every shooter would have shots that didn't feel perfect, and the key was to not let one questionable shot affect the rest of the string. As she prepared for her 8th shot, Sarah noticed that a crowd had gathered behind the firing line to watch her shoot. Word had apparently spread about her first stage performance, and people were curious to see if she could maintain that level of accuracy at the increased distance. The attention was flattering but also distracting, and she had to consciously block out the whispered comments and focus on her shooting process. Her 9th shot felt excellent from the moment she squeezed the trigger. The sight picture had been clear, her breathing controlled, and the trigger press smooth and straight back. If she could duplicate that shot for her final round, she would be satisfied with her performance regardless of the score. For her last shot, Sarah took her time and went through her complete pre-shot routine. She checked the wind flags one more time, confirmed her natural point of aim, and settled into her most comfortable shooting position. The front sight post looked crisp and clear as she aligned it with the rear sight and the target. She took a deep breath, let half of it out, and began her trigger squeeze. The final shot surprised her with its perfect trigger break, just as her grandfather had taught her it should. Sarah immediately cleared her rifle and made it safe, then stood up from her shooting position. Her lower back ached from the concrete shooting bench, and she realized she had been holding more tension in her muscles than she had intended. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" called the range officer. All shooters stepped back from the firing line for target scoring. As the range officials headed down range to score the targets, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. She had no idea how well she had performed, but she knew she had given her best effort under challenging conditions. The 200-yard distance had definitely been more difficult than the first stage, and she wondered if her lack of a spotting scope had cost her points. Robert Hayes approached her with an expression of amazement. "I've been watching you shoot through binoculars," he said quietly. "I don't want to jinx anything, but your group looked incredibly tight for iron sights at this distance. Where did you learn to read wind like that?" "My grandfather taught me to watch everything," Sarah replied. "The flags, the grass, even how the heat shimmer moves over the ground." He said wind reading was more art than science. "Your grandfather sounds like he was quite a teacher," Robert observed. "Not many people understand wind like that anymore. Most shooters rely on their equipment to tell them what the conditions are doing." The wait for target scoring felt even longer than it had after the first stage. Sarah sat on a bench and tried to stay relaxed while other competitors discussed their performances. She could hear fragments of conversations about wind calls and sight adjustments, but she tried not to let their comments influence her confidence. Finally, the range officer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Target scoring is complete for Stage 2. Results will be posted momentarily. I want to remind everyone that we still have the final stage at 300 yards, so current standings are not final." The scoreboard updated with the new results, and once again, the crowd fell silent as they processed what they were seeing. The scoreboard displayed results that defied everything the experienced shooters thought they knew about precision marksmanship. Sarah's name remained at the top of the leaderboard, and her combined score after 2 stages was beyond what anyone had thought possible with iron sights. Stage 2 results. Competitor 47, Mitchell, S., 96 out of 100 points. Combined total, 194 out of 200 points. The silence lasted only a moment before the range erupted in excited conversations. Competitors crowded around the target display board to examine Sarah's 200-yard target, searching for some explanation of how a teenager with iron sights was outperforming shooters with decades of experience and thousands of dollars worth of optical equipment. Sarah's target told another remarkable story. 8 of her 10 shots formed a group that could be covered by a silver dollar. One shot had drifted slightly high for a 9, and another had caught the edge of the 8 ring when a gust of wind had caught her by surprise. Even the shots that had cost her points were still well within the scoring area. "This is impossible," muttered a competitor whose expensive rifle was equipped with a scope that cost more than most people's cars. "Nobody shoots groups like that with iron sights at 200 yards. There has to be something we're not seeing." Betty Morrison, the elderly competition organizer, overheard the comment and responded firmly. "I've been running shooting competitions for 3 decades, and I've watched every one of this young lady's shots through binoculars. Her technique is flawless. Her wind reading is exceptional, and her mental discipline is remarkable. There's nothing impossible about it, just excellent shooting." Sarah felt the weight of scrutiny intensifying as more people gathered around her target. Some competitors seemed genuinely amazed and respectful, while others appeared suspicious or resentful. She could sense the underlying tension that came from having their assumptions about shooting challenged by someone they had initially dismissed. A local newspaper reporter who had been covering the competition approached Sarah with a notebook and camera. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Jim Patterson from the County Herald. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your shooting today? Our readers would be very interested in your story." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention but agreed to answer a few questions. The reporter asked about her training, her grandfather's influence, and her feelings about competing with iron sights against scoped rifles. She tried to answer honestly while staying focused on the final stage of the competition that still lay ahead. "One more question," the reporter said. "You're currently leading this competition by a significant margin. How confident are you about the final stage at 300 yards? Sarah considered her response carefully. 300 yards is a long way with iron sights, she admitted. The target will be very small and wind will be much more of a factor. I'll do my best and see what happens." As the reporter walked away, Sarah noticed that several competitors were studying her rifle and equipment with intense curiosity. They examined the iron sights, checked the barrel, and asked detailed questions about her ammunition. She answered their questions politely but began to feel like a specimen under a microscope. The break between stages stretched longer than usual as range officials prepared the 300-yard targets and dealt with questions about scoring procedures. Sarah used the time to call her grandfather again and tell him about her second stage performance. 96 at 200 yards with iron sights, her grandfather repeated with obvious pride. "That's championship-level shooting, girl. But I want you to remember something important. The hardest part is still ahead of you." "I know, Grandpa. 300 yards is going to be really difficult." "I'm not talking about the distance," her grandfather said gently. "I'm talking about the pressure. You've got everyone's attention now, and they're all going to be watching to see if you can keep it up. Don't let their expectations change how you shoot. Stick to what I taught you, take your time, and remember that you belong out there as much as anyone else." Sarah felt calmer after talking to her grandfather. His voice reminded her of all the quiet afternoons they had spent at the range, working on fundamentals and building the skills that were serving her so well today. She had learned to shoot not for competition or recognition, but for the pure satisfaction of doing something well. When she returned to the firing line for the final stage, Sarah could feel the tension in the air. Word had spread throughout the shooting facility about her performance, and people who weren't even competing had gathered to watch the conclusion of what was being called one of the most unusual shooting competitions in years. The 300-yard targets looked impossibly small through iron sights. At this distance, the front sight post would completely obscure the scoring area, requiring Sarah to use a hold that positioned the target just above the top of the front sight. It was a technique that demanded perfect consistency and complete trust in her point of aim. The wind had increased significantly since the earlier stages, and Sarah studied the flags carefully. The conditions were more challenging now, with gusts that varied in strength and direction. She would need to time her shots carefully and make accurate wind calls for each shot individually. "This is where equipment really matters," commented a spectator to his companion. "At 300 yards, a good scope gives you a huge advantage. She's going to struggle at this distance." Sarah tried to ignore the commentary and focus on her preparation. She had practiced at 300 yards with her grandfather, though not as extensively as at shorter distances. She knew it was possible to shoot accurately with iron sights at this range, but it would require every bit of skill and concentration she possessed. The other competitors were making extensive adjustments to their equipment for the increased distance. Scopes were being adjusted for bullet drop, wind meters were being consulted, and ballistic calculations were being checked and double-checked. Sarah had only her iron sights, her grandfather's ammunition, and her ability to read the conditions. "Competitors prepare for the final stage," announced the range officer. 10 shots at 300 yards. Time limit is 30 minutes. This stage will determine the final standings for today's competition. Sarah settled into her shooting position and immediately noticed how different everything felt at this distance. Her natural point of aim required significant adjustment, and the target seemed to swim slightly in her vision through the iron sights. She took her time getting comfortable and went through her pre-shooting checklist methodically. Around her, the other competitors were making final preparations for what they knew would be the most challenging stage of the competition. For Sarah, it would be the ultimate test of everything her grandfather had taught her about precision shooting with basic equipment. The 300-yard firing line felt like a different world from the earlier stages. Sarah looked through her iron sights at the distant target and could barely make out the black scoring area. At this distance, the front sight post would completely cover the target, forcing her to use a technique her grandfather had called the floating hold, where she positioned the target just above the sight post like a tiny ball. Balancing on a fence post, the wind had become Sarah's biggest enemy. She watched the range flags dancing in patterns that changed every few seconds. A gust from the left would shift to a crosswind from the right, then die down to almost nothing before picking up again. Reading these conditions accurately would determine whether her shots landed in the scoring rings or missed the target entirely. "Load and make ready," called the range officer, his voice carrying across the now silent range. Sarah chambered her first round and settled behind her rifle. The crowd of spectators had grown larger, and she could feel their eyes on her. Television cameras from a local news station had arrived to document what was being called an impossible performance. The pressure was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For her first shot, Sarah waited nearly 2 full minutes for the wind to calm down. She watched the flags, studied the grass movement, and even observed how the heat waves shimmered differently when the wind changed direction. Finally, she saw her opportunity during a brief lull in the wind conditions. The sight picture looked perfect as she squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled smoothly, and Sarah worked the bolt for her second shot. Without a spotting scope, she had no idea where that first bullet had landed. But the shot process had felt good. Her second shot came during another wind lull, but this time she noticed a slight mirage shift just as she fired. The bullet would probably drift slightly right, she thought, but there was nothing she could do about it now. Every shot at this distance was a gamble against the changing conditions. The competitors around her were struggling with the conditions as well. She could hear frustrated comments about wind calls and missed shots. One shooter with an expensive setup was shaking his head in disgust after what was apparently a poor shot. Even with their advanced equipment, the 300-yard distance was proving challenging for everyone. Sarah's third shot felt perfect from start to finish. She had timed the wind correctly, her sight alignment was precise, and the trigger broke cleanly. If she could shoot 9 more shots like that one, she might have a chance to maintain her leading position. By her 5th shot, Sarah had settled into a rhythm. She was reading the wind more confidently now, remembering her grandfather's advice about trusting her instincts. "Don't overthink the conditions," he had always said. "Feel them, adapt to them, and trust your first impression." The crowd behind the firing line had grown restless. Some spectators were commenting loudly about her shooting pace, wondering why she was taking so much time between shots. Sarah tried to block out their voices and focus on her grandfather's teachings about patience under pressure. Her 7th shot surprised her with how difficult the wind call had become. The flags were showing conflicting information, with some indicating wind from the left while others suggested a crosswind from the right. Sarah waited for nearly 3 minutes before she saw a pattern she could trust, then fired during what appeared to be the most favorable conditions. As she prepared for her 8th shot, Sarah noticed that several competitors had finished their strings and were watching her through spotting scopes. Their expressions were difficult to read, but she sensed a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She was still shooting, still taking her time, still trusting her iron sights against their advanced optical equipment. The 8th shot felt good, but Sarah was beginning to feel the physical strain of the competition. Her shooting position was slightly less comfortable than it had been earlier, and she could feel tension building in her neck and shoulders. She took a moment to stretch and relax before continuing. Shot number 9 required the longest wait yet for favorable wind conditions. Sarah lay behind her rifle for over 4 minutes, watching the flags and waiting for an opportunity. The crowd grew impatient, but she remembered her grandfather's most important lesson about competition shooting. Time limits are suggestions, not requirements. Take the time you need to make good shots. When the wind finally calmed, Sarah fired her 9th shot with complete confidence. The sight picture had been crystal clear, and she knew immediately that it was one of her best shots of the day. For her final shot, Sarah felt the weight of the entire competition resting on her shoulders. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but she had one more shot to fire. The target seemed even smaller now, and the wind had picked up again with unpredictable gusts that made reading the conditions nearly impossible. She waited for 5 full minutes for the right opportunity. The crowd grew silent, sensing the importance of this final shot. Even the other competitors stopped their conversations to watch. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she lay behind the rifle, waiting for the wind to cooperate. When the moment came, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The wind died down, the sight picture aligned perfectly, and she squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure her grandfather had taught her years ago. The rifle fired, and Sarah knew immediately that she had done everything right. "Cease fire, cease fire," called the range officer. All competitors stepped back from the firing line. Sarah cleared her rifle and stood up, her legs slightly shaky from the extended shooting session. She had fired 10 shots at 300 yards using only iron sights, competing against some of the best precision shooters in the region. Whether she had won or lost, she had proven that skill and training could overcome equipment disadvantages. The wait for final scoring felt like hours instead of minutes. Sarah sat on a bench and tried to stay calm while officials scored the targets and calculated final standings. Other competitors approached her with congratulations and respect, regardless of what the final results might show. When the scores were finally posted, the crowd fell completely silent. Sarah's name remained at the top of the leaderboard with a final score that nobody had thought possible. She had won the precision shooting competition using iron sights, beating every competitor with their expensive scopes and advanced equipment. The victory ceremony was a blur of handshakes, photographs, and interview requests. But for Sarah, the most important moment came when she called her grandfather to tell him the news. His weak but proud voice brought tears to her eyes as he told her how much he wished he could have been there to watch. That evening, as Sarah drove home with her trophy and medal, she realized that she had learned something more valuable than winning. She had discovered that determination, proper training, and fundamental skills could overcome any disadvantage. Her grandfather's patient teaching had given her more than shooting ability. It had given her the confidence to succeed when others expected her to fail,